If you hung around arcades in the 80s, you probably have fond memories of games like Asteroids or Pole Position, Pac-Man or Defender, Outrun, even getting into fighting games like Street Fighter. Well, what if I told you one of the most popular games in the entire world in the 1980s is one you probably had never heard of at that time, and you still might never have heard of it now. Let's take a look at the history of the game that you never heard of. Hi, I'm Stuart. I am your middle-aged hack, just a child of the 80s, trying to make his way through the 20s. And I hope you'll take that journey with me. You need to flash back in order to start this journey back to 1986. In 1986, arcade games were getting extremely detailed and complex. In just 3 or 4 years, we had moved from really, basic blocky graphics like Pac-Man into 3D graphics from things like Outrun and Space Harrier, and the just changes were coming so quickly. The designs were getting better and better, and yet there was still kind of a yearning for something simple. The 1980s were the premier time for video arcades, and a lot of people were trying a lot of different things. One company that tried something didn't quite make it to the United States at that time, and I kind of wish it had. The world knows Taito as the company that brought us Space Invaders. And to this day, that's probably the most popular game that Taito ever created or will create. As simple as it was, and this game ran in a tiny, tiny little space in memory, and it was not complex at all. The graphics were simple, and it was even in black and white. Taito never really got better than that, especially here in the United States. What they did was create a game that made absolutely no sense in the arcade, and especially not the arcade of 1986. This is Bubble Bobble. Bubble Bobble is a very simple strategy game in which you shoot out bubbles from your mouth and you trap bad guys, and then you pop the bubbles and the bad guys go away. It doesn't make a lot of sense in reality, but it doesn't matter. A lot of times things didn't make sense back then. I may get around to doing a video on Space Harrier, which was the most trippy, drug-induced game ever, and certainly made no sense. But first, Bubble Bobble. Bubble Bobble was a platformer along the lines of Mario Brothers, Donkey Kong, that kind of thing. And coming out in 1986, it must have seemed rather odd. The graphics are blocky and simple on a black background. That would have made a lot of sense in 1982, but in 1986 that was very much out of fashion. Bubble Bobble was a 2-player game. The second player could join in at any time, but the 2 players weren't competing against each other. Instead, they were working together to clear levels. And that's where kind of the strategy came in, because maybe one player would clear the first 10 levels, and then another player would come in when it started to get a little bit more complex. And so, this was something that had not been seen before. Multiplayer games were always about competition and always about score. And yes, Bubble Bobble had individual scores for different players, but it was really about collaborating. And that's kind of the neat thing about it. Bubble Bobble had a backstory. I mean, it kind of had to, because otherwise it would make no sense why you were a dragon shooting bubbles out of your mouth. Well, it turns out that the 2 dragons, who were ironically named Bub and Bob, and I swear I am not making this up, Bub and Bob had been people in real life, and they'd been turned into dragons at the same time their girlfriends had been abducted by these other monsters. They needed to make their way through this magic castle, room by room, in order to get to their girlfriends. And, spoiler alert, they do find him at the end. And I'm giving you a spoiler alert because I guarantee that if you were in an arcade in the 80s, that There is no way you made it to level 100. And that's the other weird thing about Bubble Bobble. Bubble Bobble makes a lot of sense in a home video game and even more in a retro gaming rig. I'll explain in a minute. But in an arcade, it would have taken probably 2 people, maybe 4 or 5 hours to complete 100 levels. And that's assuming they actually were able to do it, because along the way things get harder and you have to figure out different skills and stuff like that. So more likely it would take you hundreds of hours to get to the point where you got to level 100, and nobody, I can't imagine anybody doing it. I have never seen any other game where there are 100 unique levels in an arcade game. That makes sense in a home system, of course, because you can go back to it, especially in a system where you can save stuff. But in an arcade game, when Bubble Bobble came out in 1986, it was originally released only in Japan. Didn't come to the United States at all. It was extremely popular there and throughout Southeast Asia. The game itself was addictive, and people would talk about how far they could get. You would always get this, competition of people trying to get further and further. And as I said, I don't know if anybody ever really got to level 100, but a lot of people sure tried. The culture of Bubble Bobble spawned toys and sequel games, the best of which was called Puzzle Bobble, or sometimes called Bust a Move, and was also available only in Japan in an arcade version. But these characters went on and on and on. But in typical Taito fashion, of course, the original was still going to be the best. Taito took what they learned on Bubble Bobble and they ported it over. It was one of the first games that was ported over to multiple systems really very well. Because it was such a simple game in the mid-80s, it was easier to port to home systems and still maintain a lot of the same graphics and sound. The sounds were simple, and the soundtrack was a total banger, and it would still work out in an Atari or a Commodore or a Macintosh or whatever. Bubble Bobble made perfect sense in these home systems, whether they were computers or cartridge-based game systems. And it's there that a lot of people got their first look at Bubble Bobble and got addicted. I know I did. My first experience with Bubble Bobble didn't come until about 1991 when I got it for the PC and discovered how much fun it is. And it's such a faithful interpretation on the PC, you almost don't notice the difference between that and the arcade version, which is actually kind of great. Bubble Bobble went on to have this kind of low-key kind of fame, and people sought it out, and people, they sampled the soundtrack and other stuff. Bub and Bob were these, like I said, low-key celebrities for a long time. And where Bubble Bobble finally got its due, I think, is with retro gaming. Retro gaming is something I've been into for a little while. I really enjoy it. And the idea is that you take an older computer, something that can't really run a modern operating system, you put a very basic Linux-based operating system on it, and from there you can run all of these games. There's issues of legality, and I talk about that in other videos, but let's just say somehow you either have a legal copy of these games or you're willing to overlook the fact that you don't. Retro gaming systems are perfect for a long platformer like Bubble Bobble because you can save your progress anywhere. There's always multiple save states. You can go back to a level and try to figure out what you did wrong and what you didn't do wrong. Oftentimes there's cheats you can employ so that if you're so frustrated on one level that you just can't get past it, that you can just skip it and enjoy the rest of the game. This has helped games like Bubble Bobble really shine. And the funny thing is that even though I have played the later versions of Bubble Bobble and Puzzle Bobble and a lot of the other sequels that were out there, the original is still the best. The simple graphics just kind of work. They don't try to be anything that they're not. And now that it's been a bunch of years and you don't have to compare them only to games that were popular at that exact moment in time, it's awesome. And, it compares very well to Pac-Man, a game that was a lot more popular, especially in the United States. That's it for today. I hope that you like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Tell me your Bubble Bobble memories and experiences, and tell me what you want to see on this channel. I'm trying to build it up to the point where I can monetize it, and I can't do that without you.